Halo, selamat malam bagi Sobat Theovlogy di Indonesia dan juga halo semua rekan-rekan yang ada di sini. Saya sekarang akan menggunakan bahasa Inggris untuk mengantarkan kita kepada sesi ini. So, welcome again to Theology Friends. This video is the 181st of our channel. It's been a pleasure for us that our channel can provide quality conversations with fine theologians, not only those who are still in training, but also world-class theologians such as today's session. We are pleased to have Professor Michael Lee with us. Hello, Professor Michael Lee.
Hello.
So, Michael Edward Lee, PhD, is Professor of Theology with affiliation in Fordham's Latin American and Latino Studies Institute. Born in Miami, Florida, of Puerto Rican parents, he holds graduate degrees from the University of Chicago and the University of Notre Dame. At Notre Dame, Dr. Lee studied with the renowned Gustavo Guiterres, who are known to many people as the father of Latin liberation theology. Dr. Lee joined the Fordham faculty in 2004. He teaches courses in Roman Catholic theology, liberation theologies, Latin American and Latin theologies, Christology, and spirituality. Dr. Lee's research centers on how Christian reflection intersects with movements for justice. He investigates how Christian theology might spur action for justice and how, in turn, engagement in struggles for justice leads to re-examination of Christian thought. Dr. Lee is an award-winning author. His previous book, Bearing the Weight of Salvation, the Soteriology of Ignacio Ellacuría, is that how to pronounce it? Ellacuría? Oh, awesome. Won the Hispanic Theological Initiative Book Prize, sponsored by Princeton Theological Seminary. His most recent book, Revolutionary Saint, The Theological Legacy of Oscar Romero, so this is the title of our conversation today, from Orbis, earned a Catholic Press Association Book Prize. Today's interview topic is based on his book, Revolutionary Saint. We will explore the life and legacy of the newly canonized Saint Oscar Romero, former Archbishop of San Salvador in El Salvador, who was assassinated on the 24th of March, 1980s. Beatified in May 2015 and canonized by Pope Francis on the 14th of October 2018. In this book, Dr. Lee investigates how Romero's theology overcomes the dualistic and fatalistic tendencies of colonial Catholicism and offers a vision of Christianity as the faithful and historical taking up of Jesus' mission, a preferential option for the poor. In this session, we can also broaden the questions to those such as liberation theology, spirituality, salvation, or Christology. Professor Lee, once again, welcome to our channel. And I will introduce you to others moderators. So our guest moderators are not new to us. Timotheus Ferdino, a graduate student in theology at the Faculty of Theology, Duta Wacana Christian University, Yogyakarta, and Dandi Kuganda, student at Jakarta Theological Seminary, Jakarta. From our team, we have Perdian and Jessica and me, also Nindyo in New York. So let me now turn the platform to Professor Lee. Previously, your research focused on the Jesuit priest, philosopher, and university president Ignacio Ellacuría. So what made you turn your attention to Saint Oscar Romero, Professor Lee? And this time is yours.
Thank you very much. And may I say it's a real honor to be here. My research has always taken me out of the United States, mostly into Latin America. So it's nice to venture into Indonesia, even in this small way.
Hey.
I spent a good 20 years researching in El Salvador. And having focused on the Jesuit priest Ignacio Ellacuría and the rise of liberation theology in the country, it's just impossible to escape the shadow that's cast by Monsignor Romero. He is just he's inescapable. He's everywhere. In murals in the smallest villages, you'll see a painting of Monsignor Romero. Children, I saw a group of youths playing basketball, and one had a huge tattoo of Monsignor Romero on his arm. So he's everywhere. But I guess what prompted the book was an experience I had in the cathedral in San Salvador. To this very day, in the crypt, in the basement of the church, they have what's called the Romero Mass. And people come from all around the country, really, to honor the legacy of Oscar Romero. And I happened to be there. I took a group from the United States down. And on this particular Sunday, it was announced that the Pope and the Vatican in Rome had recognized Romero as a martyr. And perhaps later we can discuss a little bit more why that was such a controversial and difficult decision to arrive at. But it really marked the moment that everyone knew he would in fact be canonized, recognized as a saint by the church. So there was great celebration. There was international news about this moment. And yet, in the middle of all this celebration, I remember an elderly woman and I were speaking. And in a very kind of hushed voice, she said to me, "No sé qué van a hacer con nuestro Monseñor." She said, I fear, I don't know what they're going to do with our Monseñor. And that was a real fear, because the legacy of someone like Romero was, and continues to be contested. What did that legacy mean? And so I could tell from this campesina, this rural woman, peasant woman, that she feared what would happen now that he's officially recognized. And especially that she used that phrase, nuestro, our Monseñor. So the motivation for the book came out of asking that question. What is the legacy of this man, especially at this important moment? Not only because he's being recognized internationally in a new way, but also because that generation that knew him, that worked with him, that died alongside him, they are vanishing. And so it was important to capture in this important moment who this man was. A second motivation, though, comes from my own context. As you said in your very generous introduction, I grew up in the United States, but my parents are from Puerto Rico. And I lived in the city of Miami. And that city in the southernmost corner of the United States really is a gateway to all of Latin America. So in Miami, where I grew up, I had many Cuban classmates, Nicaraguan classmates, Argentinian classmates, Uruguay, you name it. Miami is this pan-Latin American city. And during this time, there were several revolutionary movements going on, particularly in Central America. And so the United States foreign policy, in the context of the Cold War, was the burning political issue of my university days, especially as it became clear that the United States was supporting ruthless dictatorships, horrible human rights records, but because it was in the name of anti-communism. And so there grew in the church in the United States a resistance movement calling for a change and pointing to the many Christians in Latin America who were resisting these dictatorships. And so for me, it was important also as a person in the United States to document this legacy, because I knew how involved my own country was in the dynamic but also tragic story of Oscar Romero and El Salvador. And so I chose the title of the book, Revolutionary Saint, for two reasons. The first one is obvious. He became Archbishop of San Salvador in 1977. He was archbishop for 3 years. And after his murder on March 24th of 1980, that really marks the beginning of the Salvadoran Civil War that would last 12 years and meant the deaths of 80,000 plus Salvadorans in this tiny country. And so in that revolutionary context, Romero has an amazing witness. The second meaning of revolutionary, of course, has to do with the Catholic Church, of which he was the foremost leader in his country. And that is, at the end of the 20th century, particularly after the Second Vatican Council, Roman Catholicism was going through profound changes. Some would even describe them as revolutionary changes. And I think Romero is an exemplar of the kind of faith that emerges out of this revolutionary context, and his close connection with the movement that is now dubbed liberation theology. I think he's a paradigm. I think he's a model. Now, it's not without difficulties. There's many reasons why I should not write a book on Monsignor Romero. I mean, the last thing some people would say we need is another book on a male, privileged cleric. And I understand that. But at the same time, he, in his person, but also in his office, modeled, I think, a way to be Christian and a way to be church in the world today. And so, as I went about the book, I really thought about it in terms of spirituality, that this man, who is not a professional theologian, he never wrote a book, never published an article, and yet in his weekly sermons, his homilies, in the pastoral letters he would write, there is a profound theology, but tied to a way of life, a way of being Christian, being a follower of Christ, that I think is one of the great spiritual witnesses of our time. And so that was really the goal behind this work. And what I discovered was, or what I tried to communicate, was that we live in a profoundly different time than our parents and certainly our grandparents, and perhaps every generation can say that. And yet, I think there are some real reasons why this moment in particular calls for a new kind of Christianity, or at least a Christianity that can address the larger questions of our time. That is, as we look and with those movements that we would call post-colonial movements after the Second World War, the former colonies realizing that many of the evils of our time, and as my own country wrestles with the legacy of racism and slavery, as the Latin America that I know well has still the colonial legacy of the European conquistadores who came and brought Christianity with them, that context still needs to be addressing. And so Romero, to me, is a model for a faith that can understand that. And so I chose themes from spirituality because he himself invoked these themes, but in this new way, in realizing the deep kind of structural ways that sin operates in our world. In his church and in his own faith formation, he was very well versed in identifying sin personally. In fact, he was very scrupulous about his own sinfulness, his diaries. He thinks he's the worst sinner on earth, and he's always lashing himself for lack of prayer, lack of faith. So he was keenly aware, in fact, perhaps overly aware, of his own personal sinfulness. But what happens, particularly as he becomes archbishop, is an awareness of the wider implications of sin. Now, what could that mean? What does that look like? Well, just before he became archbishop, he was appointed bishop of a very small rural area in his country. In fact, it was the area where he grew up, Santiago de Maria. And he had been living in the capital, San Salvador, for years. So he goes to this rural diocese to be its bishop, mainly coffee growing region, very poor. And he begins to realize the grave inequalities in his country. It was not that he had never seen poverty before. He knew there were poor, and he always called for those who were wealthy to be charitable, to give generously to the poor. However, in Santiago de Maria, he discovered something else. One winter evening, he was talking to his associate, and he said, where do these men who come from really all across the country during the time of the harvest? Once the coffee harvest is going, people come from all around the country because there's finally work to be done. But they don't have a place to sleep. They would sleep outside, a hammock in the trees, wherever they could find. And of course, in the mountainous regions, although it's warm during the day, at night it could be quite cold. And so Romero said, well, we have this school that's been abandoned. Why don't we open it up to give these people shelter? And he began to speak with them and hear their stories of injustice, of exploitation, of doing extreme labor for nothing, for terrible wages that they could not sustain their families with, of violence and repression whenever they asked for fair wages or even a little plot of land to grow their own food. And so Romero begins to undergo this process of really what I call seeing reality in a new way. His eyes are opened. And he goes through what the Christian tradition in many centuries has called conversion, that metanoia that the New Testament talks about. It is not that he went from no faith to faith in Christ. He had been a believer since childhood. He had been a priest for decades. And yet something profound happens in his faith life. His realization of this social sin of his country drives him to ask questions about, well, how does a Christian live? What must a Christian do in this world? And that discernment leads him to this new faith. So I think he models a new way of understanding this concept of conversion, that in a world that loves to cover up its reality, seeing that reality, seeing truth, it can shake one to one's core. It can shake one to one's foundation. And that's what happens with Romero in large part. Certainly the powerful of the country who had lobbied the Vatican to appoint him as Archbishop did not expect this process to be taking place. They had hoped for a quiet, conservative. In fact, the only time he wasn't quiet was when he was virulently attacking the Jesuits of his country as communists. It's an episode in 1972. And so that was the bishop they thought they were getting when he was appointed in March of 1977. But instead, they have this man who's going through this change. Now, he was actually named in February of 77. And 2 weeks later, a Jesuit priest by the name of Rutilio Grande was assassinated. Romero knew Rutilio Grande well. They had lived together for a few years at the seminary. And although sometimes Grande's work was maybe a little too edgy, as we might say, for Romero, he knew he was a man of integrity and a man of God. And so when he was assassinated, under the pretenses that he was a communist, Romero saw beyond that lie. And so he made two fateful decisions as he became the archbishop. The first was that he would not attend any political ceremony, any government ceremony, until these murders, because Rutillo Grande was murdered along with a 78-year-old man and a 14-year-old boy. The three of them were murdered as he was driving between the small towns of El Paisnal and Aguilares. So Romero said, and even though there was a presidential election that year and an inauguration in July, he said, I will not attend unless the murders are investigated properly. The second decision he made was to say that the funeral mass for these three victims would be the only mass in the whole country that week. Now, this sent many, and particularly of the wealthy Salvadorans and those in the government or in the military, into a fury. Why are you politicizing faith? They asked him. Why would you politicize something like the president's inauguration by not attending? It's a scandal. And Romero's response was, well, when was it not political for the archbishop to bless the new president? What he comes to realize is not if the church is involved in politics. And remember, politics comes from polis, the life of the city. His question was not if, but how. Because the colonial legacy of Catholicism in El Salvador was one linked to power. As Philip Berryman points out, if you go to any Latin American city, you go to its main square and there are two buildings there. On the one hand is the government house, and on the other side is the church, each pointing to each other, each legitimating each other. And so Romero comes to a realization that the church was caught in this politics, and it needed to have a new politics, one that was directed by the fate of those who were poor, the fate of those who were its victims. And so what the Latin American bishops in their famous meeting at Puebla called the preferential option for the poor begins to guide Monsignor Romero's ministry. And in his second pastoral letter, he really articulates what, to him, the mission of the church should be. He points out that for so long, Christianity, at least in Latin America, was dualistic. It looked to the heavens while ignoring reality on earth. There are complex reasons and a long history behind this dualism. But for Romero, the revolutionary changes that were going on with the church expressed themselves in a realization that as Jesus preached the kingdom of God, that kingdom of God was at hand. It began in the present. And so the duty of the Christian was to begin to transform the world and to make it look like that kingdom of God that Jesus preached, that will of God. And certainly was not the will of God that so many would be poor, that so many would be dying, that so many would be repressed. And this is the journey that Romero undertakes. And so as he looks to the Gospels, he sees a few key moments in Jesus's ministry that he lines up with the mission of the church. Jesus, he says, called others to conversion. Jesus defended those who were poor. And Jesus underwent persecution even unto the cross. And he says these are things that perhaps today the church has to endure. In fact, there's a story, he sadly had to preside over many funerals of those who had been kidnapped and murdered by paramilitary groups, if not the National Guard itself. And one day he was presiding over the funeral of one of his priests. And yet he started off his sermon in a shocking fashion. He said, "It is with some joy that we gather today to commemorate the murder of a priest." And many were in the audience saying, "What a joy? Has the Archbishop lost his mind?" And he said, it is a joy to see that the church is now assuming the same fate as the people. We know now that the church is incarnating itself. Another powerful word from the Christian tradition, incarnation. Except now it not only refers to God becoming flesh in the person of Jesus Christ, but it also helps to define the mission of the church as making itself present in the world where it is needed to proclaim the good news of the gospel. Incarnation. And so Romero's spirituality then has all of these turns where he invokes these so-called traditional terms, but breathes new life, new depth into them as well. Not as a replacement, but again, as a deepening of what faith today looks like. He would speak about the power of idolatry. But what idolatry? The idolatry of national security, the idolatry of private property, the idolatry of one's own political party. These were the idolatries that the Christian church needed to combat. So this profound spirituality that emerges in Romero is one that challenges the church in new ways, in ways that many find to be too difficult. And in his own day, he faced great resistance, particularly within his own church. He had perhaps his greatest foes were his fellow bishops. There were small Catholic or Christian groups who would take out ads in the national papers describing him as the devil or possessed or all sorts of gross, insulting things. And towards the end of his ministry, it became clear that his life was in danger. One of the remarkable dimensions of his ministry was his preaching every Sunday. It was broadcast over the radio. And soon it was broadcast not only throughout the country, but throughout Latin America. Many countries picked up the signal. It was said to be the most listened to story every week. One person tells a story in their village, you could walk from one end to the other, down the main street, and you would never miss a word. You could hear it coming out of houses' windows, out of cars. Everyone was tuning in to what Romero had to say. And what did he say? Again, he would do what any presider would traditionally do, that is, open up the scriptures, the scripture readings of each week, and offer meaning. But then he would shift to what he called the events of the week, or the life of the church. And he would talk about any episodes of human rights abuses, kidnappings, massacres, that people from around the country were contacting the archdiocese because it was the one organization, the one organism in the whole country that could speak this truth. And so everyone hung on the words of Monsignor. Now, of course, the archdiocesan radio station was bombed 3 times. His own life was threatened. In fact, one time there was a cache, sticks of dynamite found at the altar that should have detonated. For some reason, they did not go off, but that would have destroyed half of the building and certainly would have killed him. And yet, despite these ominous signs, Romero kept moving forward. He wasn't naive, and he wasn't, he didn't have a complex about it. He was scared. In the retreat he makes a month before he's killed, he talks to his confessor about his fears, and he criticizes himself for being scared to die. Can you imagine? And yet he says, but whatever the Lord wills, I will walk in that path. He used to be driven around by a friend of his, but by December of 1979, he said he could no longer do that. He needed to drive himself. for fear that if someone bombed the car, he didn't want anyone else to lose their life. There's a poignant story that Gustavo Gutierrez tells. Gutierrez is a Peruvian priest, and he would often travel through Central America on his way north from Peru. And he got to know Monsignor. They weren't the closest of friends, but they had a good relationship. And one time they were having a conversation on the phone. And in Spanish, when you say goodbye, one way is to say, cuídate, take care of yourself. And so the conversation was winding down, and Gutierrez says to him, Monsignor, cuídate. And there was a long pause, silence. And finally, Romero responded, well, Gustavo, you know, if I were to take care of myself, I would actually have to leave my country. But I can't. I have to stay here with my people. 10 days later, he was assassinated. It was the last conversation that the two of them ever had. And so one of the last themes from Christian spirituality that I explore through Romero is the notion of martyrdom. And the question of Romero's martyrdom is a complicated one, and I can address more about it later, but the basics is to say that that for so long in my own Catholic tradition, a martyr was recognized out of what we call odium fidei, one who dies for hatred of the faith. And many claim that Romero should not be recognized as a martyr because he died for political reasons and not his faith. It's also the very vexing question of what happens when Christians are killed precisely by other Christians that we see so much in the 20th and 21st centuries. And so I know, for one, John Sobrino, the great living Salvadoran theologian, has talked about an odium amoris, the hatred of love. That in fact, the political positions that Romero took came out of the commitment of his faith, that the two cannot be distinguished in that way. He died out of hatred for a faith that drove him to advocate for the poor, that drove him to proclaim the reality of the human rights abuses in his country. And that in fact, the example that he has for us is that's precisely the work of Christians. He was a profound man of prayer, loved to celebrate the Eucharist, was constantly taking time for prayer and for retreats. But at the same time, he adds to the vocabulary and to the actions that make up Christian discipleship to include things like defending human rights, documenting massacres. That was the work of the church. And so I hope I'm not going on too long in this section, because I do want to discuss and hear your questions. But I just found that there's such a profound spirituality for today that's discovered in this remarkable man, and I think continues to offer fruit, especially throughout the globe, because when the church makes him a saint, he is a saint. He's everyone's saint. For many years, it was said, he's already saint in El Salvador, and that's true. And yet, I think he's also the world's saint, and he has a particular contribution to make to global Christianity. So thank you for this time.
Thank you, Professor Lee. I hope you can hear me okay, because I still have issues with my internet. Well, thank you for the presentation. And I want to ask you, you touched on the way that Monsignor Romero changed his mind, changed his way of life from much more conservative and traditional in his leaning toward theology and toward church practices to more liberating in his later life. How did he? So what my question was, did he come across some liberation theology readings other than living with the poor and the marginalized, or his approach to conversion or his conversion was because of his direct encounter with the poor?
I think it's his conversion does not come from reading. Let's be clear about that. It's not from reading. However, the Brazilian liberation theologians, Leonardo and Clodovis Boff, in their introduction to liberation theology, they talk about it at three levels: the professional, the pastoral, and the popular levels. And so I would say that Romero imbibes liberation theology, particularly at the pastoral and popular levels. And it's especially in those 3 years when he's bishop in Santiago de Maria that he sees not just the poverty, the structural injustice. I mean, there was a massacre in a village in his diocese in which 6 campesinos were murdered by a unit of the National Guard. So he saw this horrific violence up and center, but he also saw these Christian-based communities that were discovering through their readings of the scripture and relating it to their own experiences, the liberating force of the gospel. This was the legacy of the teachings of the Latin American bishops at Medellin and the pastoral initiatives that were going on. I had mentioned Rutilio Grande, and there are others who were involved in this pastoral work, and these poor communities who were really generating a liberationist theology that I think profoundly moved Romero. He once attended a training session of leaders for these communities, and he was a bit suspicious of what was going on. He had heard rumors of communist indoctrination, etc. And he listened in on this session where the group was discussing a passage from the Gospels. And he was so moved that by the end he talked to the leader and said, we have much to learn from these communities. He expected to figure out what he needed to teach them, how he needed to set them straight. And he said, quite the opposite. They are the ones that need to set us straight. So to answer your question, I don't think it came through reading. He would eventually collaborate very closely with John Sobrino and Ignacio Ellacuría, probably the 2 leading professional liberation theologians in the country. But his was a more pastoral and popular liberation theology that came from his direct contact with those who were poor and those who were discovering a profound faith in liberation theology.
Thank you. Mm-hmm. So we will open up for Q&A from colleagues here. I think we can broaden also the questions, not only related to Monsignor Romero, because Professor Lee is the former student of Gustavo Gutierrez, who all we know as the father of Latin liberation theology. So why don't we ask anything about spirituality of liberation or anything? Please, friends.
Yeah.
Perdian.
Thank you, Professor Lee, for your presentations. It's so fascinating. And I have 2 questions here. The first is relating with what you several times said about the history of colonization and how it affects the political reality now. So my question is, how do you see that particular history of the involvement of missionary work, and then later on form the political reality, particularly in many Christian majority countries? And I think I don't know, but I think you also want to say that the church at some point could be also still involved to perpetuate the injustice, right? I mean, even until now. So I'm wondering also, what about the church, like for example, in El Salvador itself? So I'm wondering whether Oscar Romero may be fighting by himself, or is he supported by the church structure or by the church system to fight injustice, or maybe the church may be being split between 2 sides, right? So that's my first question. And my second question, it's also relating with my first question. How then, because you touched several times about this, how do you see then the relation between Christianity and politics? Because, for example, previously my education is at Mennonite seminary, and you know, like Nindio, for Mennonites, it's just like stark separation between politics and government and in the church, state and church. There should be no relation at all between state and church. So, what is your suggestion? Because I think this is also our problem in Indonesia, even since our independence in 1945. I mean, if I can say something critical here, I think most of the churches, I'm not saying all of the churches, but most of the churches in Indonesia still like very close attached to the government. And sometimes, and maybe even more often, supporting the government policy, even though those policies really oppressive to the people on the margin. Thank you, Prof. Lee.
Thank you. Thank you for two excellent questions. To address the first one, you certainly saw within Romero's lifetime a church that was split, deeply split. He did not receive support. In fact, he was deeply criticized, as I said earlier, by his fellow bishops, except one. In fact, it's shocking. The archbishop is murdered, and at his funeral, only one of all of the bishops even attend. So this paints the picture of division.
You're right.
And the same thing happened in his visits to Rome. You know, he was canonized, Romero was canonized a saint on the same day as Pope Paul VI, with whom he had a great affection. In fact, if you go to San Salvador today and go to Romero's room, they preserved it as it was when he was alive, and there's a little picture of Pope Paul VI on his nightstand, right? The case was very different with Pope John Paul II. And so, yes, it was a church that was divided, and I think still is today, because that, and getting back to the broader issue of this colonial legacy of Christianity, and here specifically Catholicism, but I'm sure it can be applied in different contexts, is that, well, it's of two fashions, really. On the one hand, for instance, in El Salvador, you had someone like Bishop Alvarez, who held the rank of colonel in the military.
Oh, wow.
So he was vehemently anti-communist and was opposed to any of the liberation movements in the church. In fact, when one of his priests was kidnapped and tortured, he said, well, you know, he was tortured as a man, not as a priest.
Oh my goodness.
Which I don't even understand the depths of that kind of separation. But you see how divided.
Right.
And in fact, a Salvadoran, a good friend of mine in El Salvador today, he always tells visitors, Romero is the most loved and most hated man in El Salvador. So it still speaks to divisions.
Even until now, Prof.
Even until now, even today. And so, and that has to do with power. Because while there were some who were extreme, like this bishop that I mentioned, Alvarez, who really, publicly supported the military keeping order, which we know meant massacres and torture and so on. There's that other side of the church that also took advantage of its power, but did so kind of in an unknowing way. So that when we talk about privilege, the privilege of being and enjoying the benefits without realizing the costs and what it means for others. So there's that silent portion of the church that, it might even be concerned about things, but really does nothing, but would be very, let me put it this way, be comfortable with the status quo. And so that colonial legacy, by and large, is that being established with the status quo, and so protecting it, even if it means actions that are contrary to the gospel. And many times it's not even being aware that it is. This is the evil, especially in our own time, how untruth, how the internet, for all of its beauty, that we can have a global conversation like this, can also be the source of hiding, of untruth, of masking realities as well. So that kind of transitions to the second part of your question, and this very thorny, difficult issue of politics and faith. I guess I would use the formula that Romero often invoked, and he says the church, the Christians, must be political in that organic sense of the term, the polis. It is the life of the city, the life of the people, and Christians cannot live a faith that is merely looking heavenward and ignores the profound realities on earth. So it must be political, but not partisan. So what does that mean? Romero, as many sympathies as he had with the left, would never identify the church directly with leftist groups or parties, and he always called them to never make your party or your own political slogan an idol. That was one of his main anti-idolatry, because as much as he recognized an idolatry in the national security state, in the military, he also recognized an idolatry in the guerrilla movements, etc.
Yeah.
And I'll just add very quickly that, having said that, it's wrong to put Romero in an abstract middle. Some commentators have tried to do that. The right on one side, the left on the other, and there's Romero in the middle. There was no middle in El Salvador. There was no middle. That was murdered. That was massacred. Romero was committed to the people and for the people's kind of movement. However, he did not do so naively or uncritically. And that was a key, that the political engagement, what was driving it was the values and the commitments of the gospel. And politics is a messy thing, and the nature of politics is compromise, and yet one does not compromise one's faith. So negotiating that is no easy thing. But I think Romero knew that when we are focused on what he called the world of the poor, if one is in contact with society's victims, then one can see more clearly whether the policies that one is advocating are just or unjust, can be defended from a person of faith or not, and not be blinded by one's own agenda or one's party's agenda. So, there are no easy answers here, but I think Romero really stressed how important it was to be engaged in politics in the organic sense, but not partisan, in the sense of my party and only mine, especially if it meant demonizing others. The thing he regrets most, and he writes about in his diary, is how much he wanted to find unity with his brother bishops, how he wanted those who criticized his church to understand. He didn't call them demons. He didn't, name call them, and certainly in public did not, but always called them to conversion. He didn't weaken or water down his stand, but he never, named opponents in that aggressive, violent kind of way. So I think these are kind of guideposts that maybe try and answer your question.
Can I ask one more very practical question that related with that? So, most of the time, people, particularly in this democracy time, always see that changing will comes by election, right? Changing will comes by voting, and then that's why I think even in Indonesia too, when voting season come, and then even the churches, the pastors, try to encourage their people, their pulpits, to go to vote. And then I don't know, but like now, what is happening now in this country, in the US? I mean, people just split apart, right, between right and left. So, what do you think will Romero suggest for us today if he lives now in this era, in this time?
Sorry, Professor Lee, can I add to Perdian's question?
Please.
So, of course, in terms of like populism like that, which Perdian has raised up, I want to ask, did the one who opposed Romero use labels such as Marxist or communist to Romero? to add in that question. I just curious about that. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you. Yes, very much so. He was labeled a Marxist, a communist. One bishop claimed that he was brainwashed by Jesuits. They trapped him one weekend and brainwashed him. I mean, it was incredible.
Really? By Jesuits? Yeah. Okay.
Yes. Who knew?
Wow.
Okay, Nindio, you're Marxist.
But, you know, the presidential elections in El Salvador were fraudulent the previous two times, in 72 and in 77. So Romero knew well the kind of cynicism that had set in. Most people did not trust the electoral elections, and with good reason. I mean, the military had fraudulently stolen both of those elections. So there's a great deal of cynicism. At the same time, Romero believed in the political process. In October of 1979, there is a coup in the country. Some civilians and some moderate elements in the military overthrow General Humberto Romero. And some of them, in fact, the civilians, many of them were professors at the Jesuit University, and had asked Romero's advice. And Romero cautiously gave approval to this junta that had taken control. Because in his mind, the country was just heading towards civil war. And this seemed to be one of the last hopes. Revolutionary groups, of course, saw it as a way to delegitimize the revolution, to pacify with a stand-in that wasn't going to really make a difference. And so they criticized Romero very heavily. And unfortunately, the hard-right military elements eventually overcame, and you saw even more violent repression than you had ever seen before, so much so that all of the civilians resigned by the end of that year, by the beginning of 1980. And that's when you really see the dawning of the Civil War. So what to do in this situation? I think Romero constantly called even those in the revolutionary groups. And let me say this, some have tried to portray Romero as an absolute pacifist, aligning him with figures like Mohandas Gandhi or Martin Luther King. He was not. He was not a pacifist. When he spoke of violence in his third pastoral letter, he laid out what in the Catholic Church is traditionally called as the just war tradition. And he talked even about the possibility of the morality of insurrectional violence, which was rather alarming to those in power, by the way.
Right.
He was not an advocate for a violent uprising if it could be avoided at all, but he did not want to delegitimize those groups that some of whom were as a last resort trying to defend human lives, which had become very expendable in the country at the time. So I don't know if it gives an answer to your question, but I think he would constantly, again, look to those who are suffering the most and would say, organize those efforts to address those situations as much as one can. In ethical circles, we call it subsidiarity. Do it as close to the ground and the level as you can, but realize that these changes, societal changes, are also structural changes, and you need to have agents for this kind of structural change. That's why, along with Romero, I've done a lot of work on Ignacio Ellacuría, who was the university president, and he is quite good at the university on pointing this out, on the need for the university, on those with knowledge, on those with technology, with that those skills and that power, not to give it away in the name of activism. That structural changes need people who are trained and who are committed to that kind of structural change, not just those who are doing on the ground activist work, but in concert with them and always listening to them, because that's where reality is. If not, you might get lost in your own thinking or ideologies.
Wow, thank you, Professor Lee. So deep, and there are so many takeaways that I have. Thank you.
Thank you. Timo.
Yes, thank you very much for your insightful presentation, Professor Michael Lee. I want to highlight your notion about Saint Oscar Romero, that his spirituality is incarnational. I mean, like, even then, if I heard the story about his martyrdom is so incarnational. Why I say it so? Because like you said that it challenged his assassination challenged us about the martyrdom. It's not about it's not because of other people, but it's Christian also, but because of his political view, political idea. So it's really incarnation. I mean, like, it's totally embodied. His faith is embodied in everyday life, even in his political views. But my question is, I'm really interesting when you say that he was really concerned about his sinfulness. He write about his sins in his diary. My question is then, what his views on about redemption? What does it mean to be redeemed? And is it related to liberation, or is liberation is a form of redemption, or something like that? Perhaps you could say more about this. And then my second question is, there is popular words from Saint Romero about violence of love, since you mentioned before about violence also. What does it mean, violence of love? It sounds contradictory, I think, but what does it actually mean? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Two really good questions. On the question of redemption, obviously he never had the time to lay out theological principles in an orderly fashion. But what we can cull from his preaching is that he arrives at an expansion of what redemption means. That is, I think early in his life, he was trained and understood redemption in a rather individualist kind of notion. One is saved, one's sins are forgiven, one enters into heavenly paradise. And what we see toward the end of his life, but certainly in his ministry as Archbishop, is that notion is coupled to a more, first of all, a more communal one. He talks about the salvation of the church as a whole, of the country as a whole, of the world. It's more communal, it's interpersonal. But also, and this goes to your question about liberation, that human liberation, the human thriving, is the will of God. Right? This is the will of God for humanity, that it thrives, that it lives, that it loves, all of this. And it's so the opposite of what was the lot of so many Salvadorans. And so what redemption means, during the Catholic liturgy, they pray a prayer, the Agnus Dei qui tollis peccata mundi, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. And I think Romero saw that the church, one of the duties of a Christian is to participate in that process. It's a redemptive process that does not reach its fullness until really the end of history. So liberation theology has often been criticized as being reductionist, that it equates human liberation with salvation. I think it has to do with the connection of this liberative, redemptive process that begins, right? So much of Jesus's preaching is now and not yet, but the kingdom of God is at hand. It begins now somehow. And so it's that process. And though many Christians throughout history even have understood that process within themselves, I try to live more faithfully. I try to ask forgiveness for my sins. I try to live in a way that more conforms to the gospel. They haven't thought of themselves as being part of a way of doing that socially. And that social grace needs to be manifest as well. And that taking away the sins of the world includes taking away things like poverty, like unjust social structures, of ways in which, well, as I tell my students, take the view from Mars, look at planet Earth, and see that the majority of the human beings on Earth still live in conditions of poverty. Why? And what is a Christian to do in the face of that picture? For my students in the United States, they don't realize that their purchases of clothing, right, is done in a structure of exploiting labor across the world, including your own country. But they're participating in that somehow. So Romero's spirituality on redemption is also to talk about removing this process of removing sin and bringing life, of celebrating life, which he did, and recognized in these humble communities that for people who had every reason to be cynical, to be bitter, to be hateful, he found joy. He found believers who were joyful because of their experience of the gospel, and they're working to transform not just themselves, but their communities and ultimately their country and world. So I think his notion of redemption expands in that respect. As I said, we can see grace operating even in structural forms. Now, we can't point to them. That's the kingdom. No, that's not. It's always in this tensive now and not yet. But I think to ignore that, to look away from it, is one of the sins that he saw in his own country and worked to address. So that when you confront that, you begin to understand what he means by the violence of love. When Christ says, I come to not to bring peace, but a sword. Revealing injustice, revealing especially deep structural problems, brings persecution. It brings conflict. And Romero personally experienced that. His church experienced that. And yet, in response to that, he talked about the violence of love. And I think what he means is that courage to confront. Another story: when he was bishop in Santiago de Maria, I told you about that massacre, the small town of La Cayetana. The priests from that area came to him and they said, Bishop, you need to condemn this horrific act. And his response back then was to say, no, I don't want to make a public statement. I know the president personally. I will write him a letter. I don't want to cause scandal. And yet, 3 years later, when Rutilio Grande is assassinated, he declares that one mass for the whole country. So he was no longer afraid to kind of confront the powers. And I think it's confronting the powers with that violence of love that shakes things, that threatens the powers, but does so in the way of love. I think that's what he meant by that phrase, because it took a great deal of courage and confrontation that sometimes we lose, and is a fear of losing as the years go on. We make Romero a nice figure who talked about love, but softening how really conflictive a figure he was in his own time.
Thank you, Professor.
Maybe Dandi or Jessica?
Okay, thank you, Professor Lee, for your presentation.
Yes.
I personally really admire Romero and what he has done for the poor and the marginalized. So I heard that Romero is also known for defending women's rights. Can you explain more about this? And my second question is, I heard that Romero is also against abortion. He said that the morality of life begins in the womb of a woman. What is the reason related to the context at the time? Thank you, Professor.
Yeah, maybe I'll take the second one first. There's no doubt he several times in his homilies, in his preaching, he talks and condemns abortion as a sin. I think it was part and parcel of the Catholic teaching that's still today. I don't get the sense that it was an enormous issue in El Salvador at the time. I mean, it appears one doesn't see him doing much more than that. Centers aren't founded or something like that. He doesn't sponsor legislation or anything like that. So there's no doubt. For him, he saw it as another form of defending life, which is what his archdiocese was dedicated to, defending all human lives. And so the first part of your question concerning women, it's interesting. I don't know that he would pass muster as a feminist today, and yet in what was really a machista society, very paternalistic, very male-dominated, he made a space for women. There was an organization of mothers of those who have been disappeared. Similar, we've seen them in Argentina and in other countries. These madres de los desaparecidos, they would petition police stations, and they'd go to higher offices in the government asking for husbands, for children, where they were. They had been kidnapped and no one knew their whereabouts. And they were often ignored. Women just disrespected. There's no reason to show them out or do worse to them. But Romero recognized their organization, Comadres. And for the archdiocese and for the archbishop to legitimize, to recognize this group of women was really a profound kind of statement. To these women that no one was listening to. So he gave them an authority by legitimizing them, by lifting them up and speaking about their petitions in his own homilies that were broadcast over the radio. He also hired women in the archdiocese into roles that were really unheard of before. It was so male dominated. So on a personal level as well, he empowered women to work. Maria Julia Hernandez, who's one of the great women figures in this history, she became one of the in charge of the Human Rights Defense Office. You would not have a woman like that if Romero had not opened the doors to give her an opportunity. So while I don't know that his teachings as such, are particularly groundbreaking as regards to women, it was the practical things, the way he legitimized women's groups, the way he empowered women to have positions of authority, etc., that really speak to how positively he viewed women, even for a man of his age in Latin America. And you could then see in the history of the Salvadoran Civil War, I mean, the role of women is so crucial, and you see them as leaders, incredible leaders. So there's a whole Salvadoran story there too. But thank you for those two. I hope those answered your questions.
Yes, thank you, Professor.
Okay, please, Dandi. your sound.
Okay,
Oh,
is it clear?
nice.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
Thank you, Professor Michael Lee, for your profound notion about Monsignor Romero. I have two questions for you. First of all is, how is the view of Saint Romero in reading the dark history of the church, which contribute in violence? We know that since the Second Vatican Council, the Roman Catholic Church believed that God worked throughout history, so that the church must be attentive to read the signs of times, which is God's revelation for the church. How about the Inquisition in the Middle Ages? How is Saint Romero view on that? And my second question is about, I see the similar context between El Salvador and Indonesia. We in Indonesia have experienced when President Suharto was in power for 32 years.
Mhm.
At the time, there were many kidnappings and mysterious killings of people who were deemed a threat to national security. So that President Suharto also always campaigned for national stability as a priority. So I think El Salvador has a similar context in Indonesia. And my question is, what is the meaning of peace for Saint Romero? How does Saint Romero respond to riots or anarchist action in order to uphold justice and liberate people from a dictator? Because in Indonesia, we have a great riots when President Suharto in terms. That's for me. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you. Those are really good questions. I was thinking about the second one so much. Right, the history. Romero does not say much about that history. I don't know if he had much of an opportunity to reflect on it. But if I were to hazard a guess as to the answer to your question, Romero knew church history well, and I think he would look at what were sometimes perhaps marginal figures that, at the same times as you have a Church of the Crusades, you have a Francis of Assisi. That at the same time as you have a Church of the Latin American Conquest, you have someone like Bartolomé de las Casas talking about the rights of the native indigenous people. So I think what he would do is not to disavow that history, in fact, to own it, to recognize it, to confess it, and to call the church to a conversion from the lasting legacies of those bad, dark moments in its history. At the same time, lifting up those figures who in their own time were these voices in the wilderness, the ones who were speaking against these powers. It was funny. I was talking to a British film producer who might be working on a project of a movie on Romero. And he was not a man of faith, so he always asked questions about, well, wasn't Romero cynical about the church? Wasn't he angry at the church? And I have to say, Romero was a very, very pious man. In fact, that kind of surprised me, how pious he was, even to his last day. And he was getting criticized from bishops, from the papal nuncio, even from the Vatican itself, and he never spoke critical words. Now, he didn't hesitate to point out the ways the church had made mistakes and what side the church should be taking in certain conflicts. But he never, attacked, say, the John Paul II by name or something like that. He remained, in a broader sense, he remained hopeful about the church. I think that his contact with those base communities, with courageous catechists, women religious, priests, these people were putting their lives on the line to proclaim and to live out a vision of the gospel that drove him, but also gave him hope. Gave him hope for the church itself, that while recognizing how embedded in power in the structures the church was, that at the same time there was this other liberative church that was showing the way. And so I don't think he'd be shy about owning up to that history, but I don't think he would ever let a cynicism creep in where he didn't recognize or didn't hold a deep hope for the transformational potential of the church. And so, in thinking about the role of peace, or what is peace, I think he was deeply influenced by Pope Paul VI, whom he admired greatly. And the famous slogan of Paul's was, without justice, there can be no peace. I think he saw peace as just relations between people. And that means just relations between a man and wife. And so he preached against domestic violence. It was just relations within a community, within a society, and globally. That's where peace was. And so recognizing that peace is communion between people and God. He was not disturbed, as some others were, by protests, etc. There were some who said this disorder is not peaceful, therefore it can't be of the gospel. In fact, there were some revolutionary groups who began occupying the cathedral. So Romero could not celebrate the Eucharist because the cathedral building itself had been occupied. But when one priest suggested that they cut off the water and electricity to the building so that they would have to surrender, Romero said, no, I don't care for their methods, but their cause is just. And so one time there was an occupation, and apparently those who had occupied the cathedral left a mess inside. And Romero was infuriated. And so he was able to communicate to the leaders that, they need to respect the sanctuary for what it is. And so it's kind of amusing that on a subsequent occupation, the leaders were yelling at their compatriots to take care of the church. We don't want to get Monsignor Romero mad at us. But he recognized their needs to make their voices heard. He always asked that protests be peaceful, but he recognized the validity of the protests. And he also recognized that many of these protests were condemned as violent, where actually the violence was caused by military snipers or using violence, tear gas, etc., in ways that actually fomented violence. But I think, like many of the other great leaders of our times, they recognized, like Dr. King in my country does, that there is a first violence that is structural injustice, and that we need to see the roots of some reactionary violence as rooted in that. And to just condemn the reaction is not to really get at the root of violence. And that's once again where Paul's motto of, there is no peace without justice is crucial, because especially towards the end of his life, as the situation was deteriorating in his country, Romero recognized the legitimate cause that many of these movements had. He did not approve of kidnappings and in some ways to destabilize the infrastructure that some of the guerrilla groups were using. He would condemn that. But at the same time, he recognized the legitimacy of their cause. And even, as I said before, occasionally would speak of the moral validity of violence in defending life. So it's a difficult question, but I think he was very aware that some people invoke peace really to mean a status quo that is unjust, and he would not agree with that.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Lee. In your response of my second question, I remember the words from our first president, President Sukarno, when Mr. President said, "We love freedom, we love peace, but we love freedom more." Thank you, Professor.
Thank you, Dandy. Professor Lee, there are a couple of questions that might be perfect to close our session because it's been 1 hour, 20 minutes. From host Rotu, he asked, if in Romero's life, are there any other bishops helping him? How then did he respond to other bishops who were against his way? And I think this is also related, Naomi's question. How has the church today have misunderstood Romero's liberation theology?
Really good questions. I would say in El Salvador, there was one other bishop, Bishop Rivera y Damas, who was a supporter of Romero's. They co-wrote a pastoral letter together. So he did have allies, and he had other allies that were Latin American bishops, many of the progressive bishops in Latin America. And in 1979, the Latin American bishops met in Puebla, Mexico, and Romero went and was very warmly received. So he had support in various places. But at the same time, he had a lot of opposition, as I said. Every other bishop in El Salvador was really opposed to him. Imagine, he wrote a pastoral letter, and they wrote an alternative letter to criticize him. So these are just really unheard of within church circles at the time. And as I said, he did not take really to trying to discredit them, but he did constantly ask them, call them to conversion, ask them to recognize what was going on in the country, to recognize what was going on in the church even. But it was a source of real despair. I think if there were one sadness that Romero carried with him, it was how much division there was even amongst his brother bishops. And so the second question was, in terms of being misunderstood, I think, there are kind of two different misunderstandings. On the one, it's those who have heard a kind of caricature of what liberation theology meant and have equated Romero as kind of a politician. It's funny, when writing the book, I was in contact with a lot of political scientists and historians and who have written very eloquently about the different agents in the Civil War, but don't quite understand the motivation of faith. And so one misunderstanding has been to merely to make Romero a political figure in that sense, and to not recognize that the entire motivation of his life and all of his political actions was in fact his faith. It's wonderful that the United Nations has made the death of the anniversary of his death as their Human Rights Day, but one does not want to let that overlook the fact that he was a man of faith and entirely motivated by that faith. The other misunderstanding, I would say, is those who would spiritualize Romero in such a way that they don't let him challenge them to address the very same ills in their own contexts. Romero is a very challenging figure who calls for a deep engagement, and a new way of looking at faith as well. I think he challenges faith, and I fear sometimes that, especially with the mantle of sainthood, that he's misunderstood and watered down in a way that is very nice, but very palatable. Or he's placed in the middle, as I said earlier, between a right and a left, and he occupies this nowhere place that never existed. So those are two misunderstandings that I fear.
Professor Lee, can I have a quick question? I mean, while I'm listening your explanation about the previous question. I was wondering, was there a third party like a bishop? I mean, who don't oppose Romero, but they keep silent like that? It's like a silent voice like that. But they know there's something wrong with the church, but they keep silent like that.
Yeah, I think early on there were, but I think over the course of his ministry, there was such a polarization in the country that that really the middle kind of empties out, and it becomes difficult. I mean, it's difficult to know. Obviously, there were those who were silent, but we don't have a record of them because, in fact, they were silent. But I also think that things were so tense and so divisive and so polarized by the time of his assassination that it's very difficult to find anyone kind of in the middle, because if you spoke in any way for human rights, for justice, you were termed a communist and you could be killed, you could be murdered, you could be tortured. It was that difficult a situation. So I think especially early on, there were many who were silent, who were trepidatious about revolutionary movements, about these radicals. But I think as things hardened, that middle kind of empties out tragically, because we see the effects of that polarization, and it only dragged on the horrific civil war.
Okay. Oh, by the way, thank you very much. I think our discussion is really a great resource for me, especially for my research in public theology. Wow. Cool.
Great.
Thank you. Michael, I'm wondering what has made, what is the spiritual resources for Romero, for Saint Romero, that we can adopt or adapt for our life today, especially dealing with the current political situation?
Well, I think Romero was a man of profound prayer, and his prayer was often directed to discernment. And I think as we draw upon the riches of contemplative prayer, for instance, in the Christian tradition, that seeking God meant not just seeking God in the interior spaces, which he did. He was often found alone in prayer for hours. Meetings would be taking place. Where's Monsignor? Go find him. He was in prayer. But it's combining that search for God interiorly with a search for God in the world, to discern in the movements of his country and of his people the movement of God, of the Spirit. And I think that takes a spiritual disposition. That takes as much work as we've seen in the mystics about silence and words and images. It's that kind of training, right? There's often the language of spiritual exercises and of training. I think it takes training to discern that phrase I think Danda used earlier, that to read the signs of the times is a spiritual task that takes a spiritual discernment. And so that was very nourished by his life of prayer. And the other sense was the communal nature of his faith. You know, he inherited a rather anti-Protestant legacy, and he gathered with pastors of other Christian denominations once, and he called them separated brethren. And one of them, a Methodist bishop, said, "You know, Monsignor, can you just call us brothers and not separated?" And he said, "You know, you're right." And he never used that phrase again, one he had used his whole life. "You truly are my brothers and sisters," he said. So I think he recognized how many divisions we still hold, even within the Christian church. And as profound a personal spirituality as he had, it was always in a communal dimension. You know, if you read his diary, what he talks about more than anything else is making trips around the country, visiting communities and worshiping with them. That was what he drew strength from. So Those are powerful resources for him, and why I think he's such a powerful resource for us today. And especially in nations who have undergone histories of violence, histories of colonialism, like your own. I think Romero is an amazing resource. And you could bring a lot to reading Romero, and from your own context, and shedding light on his words, his ministry and context as well. So I look forward to future work on Romero from you in Indonesia.
Well, thank you very much. Saint Romero can be a profound example for us today, and especially if you read Professor Michael Lee's Revolutionary Saint, the Theological Legacy of Oscar Romero. Professor Lee, thank you very much for such an engaging and inspiring conversation with you. Thank you for your time. Thank you for stopping by on our channel.
Oh, thank you. It's a real honor for me and a blessing.
Thank you very much. All right, friends. So this is the end of our conversation for today, and we will have another conversation tomorrow with Principal Richard Topping from Vancouver School of Theology on Calvert and theological interpretation on the scripture. So we'll see you again tomorrow. And again, Professor Lee, Dandy, Timo, Jessica, and also Takper, thank you for your accompanying being with us. Thank you. Bye.